The two men in fake police uniforms were stepping toward me with zip ties in their hands. Karen stood behind them with that smug smile I had grown to hate, pointing at me like I was some common criminal. "You are under arrest for criminal HOA violations," the taller fake officer announced, his voice shaking with nervous energy. I looked at their poorly made badges. I noticed their incorrect uniform patches. I saw the way they held themselves like amateurs playing dress-up instead of trained professionals. These were not real cops. But they did not know what I was. As they moved closer, I remained perfectly still. My years of federal training kicked in. I analyzed their positioning. I calculated their next moves. I prepared for what would happen when they discovered the truth. Karen stepped forward, her clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield. "Take him away," she commanded with the authority she thought she possessed. That was when I realized that Karen Morrison had just made the biggest mistake of her entire life. 3 months ago, I thought I had found paradise. After 15 years as a U.S. Marshal, chasing dangerous fugitives across state lines and serving high-risk federal warrants, I was ready for some peace. The small suburban neighborhood of Willowbrook seemed perfect. Quiet streets, mature trees, friendly neighbors waving from their front porches. I had purchased a modest 2-story home on Maple Street with my savings. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. The previous owner had maintained it well, and I looked forward to simple weekends working in the garden instead of hunting federal criminals. That dream lasted exactly 2 weeks. I was outside watering my new flower beds when she first appeared. Karen Morrison walked up my driveway like she owned it, carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression that screamed authority. She was a woman in her early 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of outfit that cost more than most people made in a week. "Excuse me," she called out, not bothering with introductions. "I am Karen Morrison, president of the Willowbrook Homeowners Association. We need to discuss several violations." I turned off the hose and walked over, extending my hand in greeting. "Nice to meet you, Karen. I am the new owner here. What can I help you with?" She ignored my outstretched hand and flipped through papers on her clipboard. "Your lawn height exceeds HOA standards by half an inch. Your mailbox is painted the wrong shade of black. Those flower decorations are not approved colors." I looked at my modest garden gnomes and smiled. I am still settling in. If there are specific rules I need to follow, I would be happy to review them and make adjustments. Karen's eyes narrowed. "This is not a negotiation. These are violations that require immediate correction. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $50 per violation." Something in her tone triggered my professional instincts. In my line of work, I had learned to read people quickly. Karen Morrison was not just enforcing rules. She was testing me, probing for weakness, establishing dominance. "I understand," I replied calmly. "Could you provide me with a copy of the HOA bylaws so I can review the specific requirements?" "The bylaws are available for purchase at the monthly meeting," she snapped. $25, cash only." That was my first red flag. Legitimate HOA documents should be freely available to homeowners. But I kept my concerns to myself and nodded politely. Over the next few days, I watched Karen operate. She walked the neighborhood daily with her clipboard, measuring grass, examining paint colors, and writing violation notices. But I noticed a pattern. She targeted specific homes: the elderly couple on the corner who struggled with yard maintenance, the single mother with 3 kids who worked double shifts, the young military family who had just moved in. She avoided the larger homes, the ones with expensive cars and manicured lawns, the ones whose owners clearly had money to fight back. Karen Morrison was a predator, and predators always go after the weakest prey. I decided to do some research. Using skills I had developed investigating federal cases, I started gathering information. I spoke with neighbors casually. I researched property records. I looked up HOA registration documents at the county courthouse. What I found disturbed me. The Willowbrook HOA had been legitimate once, but over the past 3 years, Karen had systematically taken control. Board members had resigned or moved away. Meetings were held irregularly and poorly announced. Financial records were kept secret. Karen Morrison had created her own little kingdom, and she ruled it through fear, intimidation, and the threat of financial ruin. But she had no idea that her newest neighbor had spent his career taking down people who thought they were above the law. The storm was coming. Karen just did not know it yet. The violation notices started arriving daily. Each morning, I would find a new piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper or taped to my front door. The infractions became increasingly ridiculous. Unauthorized bird feeding detected in backyard area. Excessive lawn watering observed during restricted hours. Garden decoration colors do not comply with seasonal requirements. I kept every single notice. In my line of work, documentation was everything. Each piece of paper was evidence of harassment. Each ridiculous claim was another nail in Karen's eventual coffin. But the notices were just the beginning. I came home from a grocery run to find Karen standing in my driveway with a measuring tape, documenting the distance between my car and the garage door. She did not ask permission. She did not acknowledge my presence. She simply measured and wrote notes like she owned the property. "What are you doing?" I asked, keeping my voice level and professional. "Vehicle positioning audit," she replied without looking up. "Your car is parked 3 inches beyond the approved setback line." I had dealt with dangerous fugitives who were more reasonable than this woman. That evening, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. I needed to understand the full scope of what Karen was doing. What I discovered made my blood boil. At 412 Oak Street, I found Mrs. Henderson crying on her front porch. She was 82 years old and had lived in the neighborhood for 30 years. Karen had placed a lien on her home for unpaid HOA fines totaling $3,000. "She says I have to pay or they will take my house," Mrs. Henderson sobbed. "But I do not understand what I did wrong. My late husband always took care of these things." I sat down beside her and gently asked to see the paperwork. What I found was stunning. The violation notices were printed on official-looking letterhead. The legal language appeared legitimate. The fines seemed to follow proper escalation procedures. But something was wrong. The signatures did not match. The legal references were incorrect. The HOA registration numbers were fabricated. Karen Morrison was not just harassing people, she was committing fraud. Over the next 2 weeks, I conducted a thorough investigation. I spoke with every neighbor who would talk to me. I collected copies of violation notices, fine assessments, and legal threats. I researched every document Karen had produced. The pattern was clear and criminal. Karen had created fake letterhead using a computer and printer. She had fabricated a larger HOA board that did not exist. She had been collecting illegal fines and depositing them into a personal bank account. She had used intimidation and fake legal documents to terrorize families who could not afford to fight back. At 608 Elm Street, the Rodriguez family was facing eviction threats over $800 in supposed violations. Their crime: planting tomatoes in their backyard without HOA approval. At 334 Pine Avenue, young military couple Mark and Sarah were being threatened with legal action for parking their second car on the street overnight. Karen claimed this violated noise ordinances that did not exist. At 729 Maple Drive, recently widowed Mr. Thompson was being fined $50 per day for his grass being too long. He had been in the hospital for surgery and physically could not maintain his yard. Karen Morrison had turned the American dream of homeownership into a nightmare of fear and financial ruin. She preyed on people who trusted authority and could not afford lawyers. She used official-looking documents to steal money from families who were already struggling. But she had made one critical error. She had targeted a federal law enforcement officer who specialized in investigating fraud and taking down criminals who thought they were untouchable. I spent my evenings building a case file. I documented every violation notice. I photographed forged signatures. I traced financial records. I interviewed victims and gathered witness statements. Karen Morrison thought she was running a neighborhood HOA. What she was actually running was a criminal enterprise that involved fraud, forgery, extortion, and racketeering. Federal crimes that carried serious prison time. I had prosecuted organized crime figures for less evidence than what Karen had handed me on silver platters. She had been so confident in her petty authority that she had documented her own criminal activity in meticulous detail. The investigation was almost complete. The evidence was overwhelming. The case was airtight. All I needed now was for Karen to make one final mistake that would give me the legal authority to bring her down. I did not have to wait long. It was a Tuesday morning when Karen decided to escalate beyond harassment into felony territory. I was enjoying my coffee on the front porch when I saw them coming up the street. 3 figures walking toward my house with purposeful strides. Karen was in the lead, carrying her ever-present clipboard like a badge of office. Behind her walked 2 men in what appeared to be law enforcement uniforms. They wore dark blue shirts with official-looking patches and carried themselves with the exaggerated swagger of people trying too hard to look authoritative. My federal training kicked in immediately. I analyzed their appearance with professional eyes while sipping my coffee and maintaining a relaxed posture. The uniforms were wrong. The patches were poorly made. The badges were obviously fake. These men were not law enforcement officers. But they were about to pretend to be. Karen stopped at the bottom of my front steps and looked up at me with undisguised satisfaction. "Mr. Anderson, these are Officers Johnson and Martinez from the HOA Enforcement Division. They are here to place you under arrest for criminal violations of community standards." I set down my coffee cup slowly and stood up. "Good morning, gentlemen. Could I see your identification and credentials?" The taller fake officer, supposedly Johnson, stepped forward. "Sir, you need to come with us immediately. You are being charged with willful violation of homeowner association regulations, failure to comply with lawful orders, and criminal trespassing on community property." I almost smiled. In 15 years of federal law enforcement, I had never heard such creative legal terminology. These charges did not exist in any criminal code anywhere in America. "I understand," I replied calmly, "but I would still like to see your official identification and understand which agency you represent." Officer Martinez pulled out what appeared to be a badge wallet and flashed it quickly. Too quickly. The badge was plastic. The identification card was obviously printed on a home computer. The agency name was fictional. Karen stepped forward impatiently. "He does not need to see anything. You have your orders. Take him into custody." This was the moment I had been waiting for. Karen Morrison had just crossed the line from harassment and fraud into impersonating federal officers and attempted kidnapping. These were serious federal crimes with mandatory prison sentences. But I wanted to give them every opportunity to make their case worse. "Officers, what exactly is the HOA Enforcement Division? I am not familiar with that agency." Johnson looked nervous. "It is a special unit that handles serious HOA violations. We work with local police and have arrest authority for community standards crimes." I nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting. What is your badge number, Officer Johnson?" He fumbled with his fake badge. It is 2847. "And which police academy did you attend?" "The, Regional Community Standards Academy." "In which state?" "Here, this state, the local one." Karen was getting agitated. "Stop asking questions and cooperate. These officers have authority to arrest you." I looked at Martinez. "Officer Martinez, could you explain the legal process for these community standards crimes? Do they go through municipal court or county court?" Martinez looked at Johnson. Johnson looked at Karen. Karen looked furious. "The legal process is not your concern," Karen snapped. "Your concern is following the lawful orders of these officers." "Of course," I replied. "But as an American citizen, I have certain constitutional rights. I would like to understand the charges and the legal process before I cooperate with any arrest." That was when Karen made her final, fatal mistake. "You do not have rights when you violate HOA regulations," she snarled. "These officers have authority to arrest you, search your property, and hold you until you agree to pay your fines. Your constitutional rights do not apply to HOA enforcement." The fake officers nodded in agreement. "That is correct, sir. HOA violations supersede normal legal protections." I felt a surge of satisfaction. Karen had just confessed to conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, a federal crime that carried up to 10 years in prison. But they were not done digging their hole deeper. Johnson stepped forward and pulled out zip ties. "Sir, you need to turn around and put your hands behind your back. You are under arrest." Martinez moved to my left side, attempting to flank me like they had planned this maneuver. "Do not resist, or we will add additional charges." Karen smiled triumphantly. "Finally, someone who will not tolerate your disrespect for community standards." I remained perfectly still, my hands visible and my posture non-threatening. In my mind, I was already calculating the federal charges these three would face: conspiracy, fraud, impersonating federal officers, attempted kidnapping, civil rights violations. They were looking at decades in federal prison. Johnson reached toward me with the zip ties. "Turn around now, sir." That was when I decided it was time to end this charade. I reached slowly into my back pocket and pulled out my federal credentials. I held them up so all three could see clearly. "Before you go any further," I said in my calm, professional voice, "I think you should know who you are trying to arrest." I opened the leather wallet to reveal my official U.S Marshal badge and identification. "I am Deputy U.S Marshal David Anderson, and you three have just committed multiple federal crimes." The silence that followed was deafening. The reaction was instant and dramatic. Officer Martinez dropped his zip ties and took 3 steps backward, his face turning pale as paper. Officer Johnson froze mid-reach, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. His fake badge suddenly looked like a toy in comparison to my federal credentials. But it was Corinne's reaction that I will never forget. Her smug expression melted away like ice in the summer sun. Her clipboard fell from her hands and clattered on the concrete sidewalk. Her eyes went wide with the kind of terror that comes from realizing you have just made a life-destroying mistake. That is not possible," she stammered. "You are just a regular homeowner. You work from home. I am a deputy U.S. Marshal," I repeated, my voice carrying the authority of 15 years in federal law enforcement. "And you three have just attempted to impersonate federal officers, conspired to commit kidnapping, and violated civil rights under color of law." Martinez was already backing toward the street. "This is a misunderstanding. You were just committing federal crimes," I interrupted. "Do not move. Do not leave. Do not make this worse than it already is." I pulled out my radio and keyed the microphone. "Dispatch, this is Marshal Anderson, badge number 7394. I need immediate backup at 1247 Maple Street for multiple subjects in custody on federal charges." The dispatcher's voice crackled back immediately. "Copy, Marshal Anderson. Units are en route. ETA 4 minutes." Corinne found her voice, though it was shaky and desperate. "Wait, this is all a big misunderstanding. We were not really going to arrest you. It was just what, Corinne? Just fraud. Just impersonating officers. Just attempted kidnapping of a federal law enforcement officer." Johnson tried to run. He made it exactly 15 feet before my training kicked in. Years of chasing dangerous fugitives had taught me how to move fast and efficiently. I caught him before he reached the sidewalk, placing him in a control hold that left him face down on my front lawn. "Federal law enforcement," I announced loudly enough for the gathering neighbors to hear. "You are under arrest." Martinez immediately dropped to his knees with his hands up. I surrender. Please do not hurt me." Corinne stood frozen in shock, staring at my badge like it was something from another planet. I could hear sirens in the distance. Real sirens. From real police officers who were about to arrive and witness the aftermath of Corinne's spectacular failure. "Let me explain what happens next," I said, my voice professional and calm. "In approximately 3 minutes, local police will arrive to secure this scene. Within an hour, FBI agents will arrive to begin processing federal charges. Within 24 hours, you will all be in federal custody facing charges that carry mandatory minimum sentences." Corinne's legs gave out. She sat down hard on my front steps, her face buried in her hands. "I did not know," she whispered. "I had no idea you were a federal law enforcement officer that you have been harassing for months with fraudulent documents and illegal fines." I finished. "The same federal law enforcement officer you just tried to have kidnapped by fake police officers." The sirens were getting closer. I could see neighbors coming out of their houses, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Henderson was standing on her porch, watching the woman who had terrorized her sitting defeated on my front steps. "Corinne," I continued, "do you want to know what your biggest mistake was?" She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. "Your biggest mistake was not the fake officers. It was not even trying to have me arrested. Your biggest mistake was thinking that badges and authority come from clipboards and intimidation." The first police car rounded the corner, its emergency lights painting the street in red and blue. "Real authority comes from serving others, not terrorizing them. Real power comes from protecting people, not preying on them. And real justice comes from following the law, not making it up as you go." Martinez was crying now. Johnson was still face down on my lawn, completely subdued. Karen was staring at the approaching police cars like they were harbingers of doom. The federal agents will want to know about all the other families you have been defrauding, I continued. The fake documents, the illegal fines, the forged signatures, the fabricated legal threats. I looked at her directly. Karen Morrison, you are about to discover the difference between fake authority and the real thing. The police cars pulled up to the curb, and real officers began stepping out. The show was about to begin. The next hour unfolded like a perfectly choreographed federal operation. 3 local police units arrived first, followed by 2 unmarked FBI vehicles. Special Agent Sarah Chen, whom I had worked with on previous cases, stepped out of the lead car and walked over to where I was maintaining custody of the 3 suspects. Marshal Anderson, she greeted me with professional courtesy. Dispatch said you called in federal charges. I handed her my preliminary report and evidence file. Conspiracy to impersonate federal officers, attempted kidnapping of a federal agent, fraud, forgery, extortion, and civil rights violations under color of law. Agent Chen raised an eyebrow as she flipped through the documentation. You have been busy. This goes much deeper than today's incident, I explained. Karen Morrison has been running a fraudulent HOA scheme for years. I have documented evidence of systematic financial crimes against dozens of families. By now, a crowd of neighbors had gathered at a respectful distance. I could see Mrs. Henderson, the Rodriguez family, Mr. Thompson, and many others watching as their tormentor was processed by real law enforcement. Karen sat in the back of a police car, her hands cuffed behind her back, staring at the scene in shock. The 2 fake officers were in separate vehicles, both having confessed immediately in hopes of reduced sentences. Officers Johnson and Martinez have agreed to cooperate fully, Agent Chen informed me. They claim Karen hired them through an online classified ad, paid them $500 each to dress up and intimidate you. Conspiracy to commit multiple federal crimes, I noted. She planned this. What she planned was the end of her freedom, Agent Chen replied grimly. Detective Mike Rodriguez from the local police department joined our conversation. Marshal Anderson, we have been getting complaints about this HOA situation for months, but every time we investigated, the paperwork looked legitimate. Because Karen is skilled at document forgery, I explained. She created fake letterhead, fabricated legal references, and used official-sounding language to intimidate people who trusted the system. I walked Detective Rodriguez through my evidence file, showing him examples of forged signatures, fabricated violation codes, and illegal fine assessments. His expression grew darker with each document. This is extensive fraud, he said. How many families are we talking about? At least 47 that I have documented. Total financial damages exceeding $50,000 in illegal fines and fees. Agent Chen whistled softly. Federal racketeering charges. As if summoned by our conversation, Mrs. Henderson approached hesitantly. She was carrying a manila folder stuffed with papers. Excuse me, she said quietly. Are you the officers investigating Karen Morrison? Yes, ma'am, Agent Chen replied gently. How can we help you? Mrs. Henderson's hands trembled as she opened her folder. I have been keeping all the papers she gave me, all the fines and threats and legal notices. I was so scared I was going to lose my house. The folder contained dozens of fraudulent documents. Each one was evidence of Karen's systematic criminal enterprise. Each one represented fear and sleepless nights for an elderly woman who had done nothing wrong. "Ma'am," I said softly, "you are not going to lose your house. Corinne Morrison was running an illegal scheme. None of those fines are valid. None of those threats have any legal authority." Mrs. Henderson began crying with relief. "I have been so worried. I did not know what to do or who to trust." Within minutes, other neighbors were coming forward with their own folders full of fraudulent documents. The Rodriguez family brought $800 worth of fake violations. The military couple brought $1,200 in fabricated fines. Mr. Thompson brought $2,000 in illegal assessments. Agent Chen looked at the growing pile of evidence with satisfaction. Corinne Morrison just became a federal priority case. Detective Rodriguez was interviewing the fake officers separately. Both men were singing like birds, providing detailed information about how Corinne had recruited them, what she had told them to do, and how she had planned the fake arrest. "She told us he was just some troublemaker who would not pay his HOA fines," Officer Martinez confessed. "She said HOA enforcement officers had special authority to make arrests. We believed her. She paid us in cash and gave us the fake badges," Officer Johnson added. "She said she had done this before with other problem homeowners." That statement caught everyone's attention. Corinne had apparently made a habit of using intimidation and fake authority to terrorize residents. This was not her first attempt at impersonating law enforcement. As the investigation expanded, a local news crew arrived to cover the story. The reporter, Jessica Walsh from Channel 7 News, approached me for an interview. "Marshal Anderson, can you tell us how a neighborhood HOA dispute escalated into federal charges?" I chose my words carefully. What happened here was not a simple HOA dispute. This was a multi-year criminal enterprise involving fraud, forgery, extortion, and ultimately the impersonation of federal officers. Corinne Morrison systematically targeted vulnerable families and used fake legal authority to steal money and terrorize innocent people. The reporter turned to film Corinne being transferred from the police car to the FBI vehicle. Corinne looked directly into the camera, her face a mask of defeat and terror. "What message does this send to other HOA officials who might be abusing their authority?" the reporter asked. I looked directly into the camera. Real authority comes from serving your community, not exploiting it. The moment you cross the line from legitimate governance into criminal behavior, you become the subject of a federal investigation. And federal investigations do not end well for criminals. Agent Chen walked over with an update. "We have search warrants for Corinne's home and financial records. This investigation is going to get much bigger before it is finished." I nodded with satisfaction. Corinne Morrison wanted to play police officer. Now she gets to meet the real ones. 3 weeks later, I sat in the federal courthouse as Corinne Morrison's case began to unravel completely. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit had torn through her records like a hurricane through a trailer park. What they found exceeded even my expectations for criminal behavior. Special Agent Chen presented the evidence to the packed courtroom. Over the past 4 years, the defendant created and operated a fraudulent homeowners association scheme that netted over $78,000 in illegal fines and fees. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Blake, painted a picture of systematic criminal enterprise. Corinne Morrison did not just make up rules. She created an entire fake legal system designed to terrorize and financially exploit her neighbors. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed deposits from dozens of families who had paid fake fines. Computer files revealed templates for forged legal documents. Email records showed Corinne researching how to create official-looking letterhead and fake government seals. But the most damning evidence came from her own files. Corinne had kept meticulous records of her victims. She had categorized families by their vulnerability. Single mothers, elderly residents, young couples, and military families were specifically targeted because they were less likely to fight back. She had written notes like elderly woman scared, will pay quickly, and military couple, deployed husband, wife alone with kids, easy target. Judge Patricia Williams looked disgusted as she reviewed the evidence. Ms. Morrison, you did not just commit financial crimes. You preyed on the most vulnerable members of your community with calculated cruelty. Corinne's defense attorney tried to argue that this was simply overzealous HOA enforcement, but the federal charges were too serious and the evidence too clear. Impersonating federal officers, 5 years mandatory minimum. Conspiracy to commit kidnapping, 10 years mandatory minimum. Mail fraud, 20 years maximum. Wire fraud, 20 years maximum. Racketeering, 20 years maximum. Civil rights violations, 10 years maximum. The fake officers, Johnson and Martinez, had already pleaded guilty to lesser charges in exchange for cooperation. They would serve 18 months each and pay restitution to the families they had helped terrorize. But Corinne was facing the full weight of federal justice. During the sentencing phase, victim after victim testified about the fear and financial hardship Corinne had caused. Mrs. Henderson spoke about sleepless nights worrying about losing her home. The Rodriguez family described the stress of trying to scrape together money for fake fines while supporting 3 children. Mr. Thompson talked about the humiliation of being fined while recovering from surgery. The judge listened to every story with growing anger. Ms. Morrison, Judge Williams said during sentencing, you turned the American dream of homeownership into a nightmare of fear and exploitation. You targeted families who trusted the system and could not afford to fight back. You stole their money, their peace of mind, and their sense of security in their own homes. Corinne stood before the judge, her expensive clothes replaced by an orange jumpsuit, her perfect hair unkempt, her arrogant demeanor completely gone. I sentence you to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You will pay full restitution to all victims, totaling $87,000 including damages and legal fees. You are permanently barred from serving in any HOA or community association capacity. The courtroom erupted in applause from the dozens of neighbors who had come to witness justice. But the story did not end with Corinne's sentencing. The neighborhood came together to form a legitimate HOA with transparent bylaws, elected leadership, and proper financial oversight. The new board's first action was to establish an emergency fund to help elderly and struggling residents with home maintenance. Mrs. Henderson was elected as treasurer. The Rodriguez family volunteered to organize community events. Mr. Thompson became the neighborhood watch coordinator. From the ashes of Corinne's criminal empire, a real community was born. As I watched my neighbors working together to build something positive, I reflected on the difference between legitimate authority and criminal exploitation. Real leadership serves others. Real community protects its most vulnerable members. Real justice holds everyone accountable to the same standard. Corinne Morrison had learned that lesson the hard way. 6 months after Corinne's sentencing, I was sitting on my front porch enjoying my morning coffee when a moving truck pulled up across the street. A young couple with two small children began unloading boxes, looking excited and nervous about their new home. It reminded me of my own arrival in Willowbrook, back when I thought I was just looking for a quiet place to relax between federal assignments. Mrs. Henderson walked over from her house carrying a plate of homemade cookies. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she called out cheerfully. The transformation was remarkable. The same street that had once been filled with fear and tension now buzzed with genuine community spirit. Children played in yards without worrying about grass height violations. Neighbors helped each other with projects without fear of arbitrary fines. People decorated their homes according to their own taste without harassment from fake authorities. The new HOA board met monthly in the community center, with meetings open to all residents and financial records available for public review. Decisions were made democratically, disputes were resolved fairly, and the focus was on maintaining property values through cooperation rather than intimidation. But the most satisfying change was seeing former victims reclaim their confidence. Mrs. Henderson had become a fierce advocate for elderly residents, helping them navigate legitimate home maintenance issues and connecting them with trusted contractors. The Rodriguez family organized monthly block parties that brought everyone together. Mr. Thompson started a neighborhood garden where residents could grow vegetables and share the harvest. The military couple, Mark and Sarah, had returned from deployment to find their home surrounded by neighbors who had maintained their yard and watched their property. Instead of facing fake fines, they were welcomed back as heroes. I often thought about Corinne during these peaceful moments. She was serving her time in federal prison, probably wondering how her simple scheme to control a neighborhood had destroyed her entire life. The federal system was not like local jail. There were no early releases for good behavior on racketeering charges. She would serve every day of her 12-year sentence. The fake officers had been released after 18 months, but their criminal records would follow them forever. No security company would hire them. No legitimate law enforcement agency would consider their applications. They had traded a few $100s for ruined careers and permanent shame. But justice was not just about punishment, it was about prevention. Word of the Corinne Morrison case had spread throughout law enforcement circles. FBI field offices were using it as a training example for HOA fraud investigations. U.S. attorney offices were sharing the prosecution strategy with colleagues facing similar cases. The story had become a cautionary tale about what happens when petty tyranny crosses into federal crime. I had received calls from U.S. Marshals in other districts dealing with similar situations. The patterns were always the same. A power-hungry individual takes control of an HOA. They create fake rules and illegal fines. They target vulnerable residents. They escalate when challenged. But now law enforcement knew what to look for and how to build federal cases against HOA criminals. My own role in the neighborhood had evolved as well. I was not just the guy who took down Corinne Morrison. I had become the informal community protector, the person neighbors came to when they faced problems or needed advice. A new resident approached me that afternoon, introducing himself as David Park, a software engineer who had just moved in with his family. "I heard about what happened with the previous HOA situation," he said carefully. "I want you to know that we appreciate having someone like you in the neighborhood." I smiled and shook his hand. "Welcome to Willowbrook, David. You will find this is a real community now. People help each other instead of preying on each other." As evening approached and the street lights came on, I watched children playing in yards while their parents chatted on front porches. I saw elderly residents walking their dogs without fear. I observed military families displaying their flags with pride instead of worry about violations. This was what I had been looking for when I first moved to Willowbrook. Not just a quiet place to live, but a real community where people could feel safe and secure in their own homes. Corinne Morrison had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible. She had shown me the difference between fake authority and real leadership. She had taught the entire neighborhood that bullies can be defeated when good people stand together. And she had learned that when you try to arrest a U.S. Marshal, you better make sure your badges are real. The neighborhood was finally at peace, and I was exactly where I belonged,